We are live.
All right, hello and welcome to Special Education Law and Effective Parent Advocacy. My name is Alyssa Thorn and I'm a staff attorney at Project HEAL, which stands for Health, Education, Advocacy, and Law at Kennedy Krieger Institute. And I'm also on the ARC Baltimore Board of Directors. I'm co-presenting today with Rodney Toulson. Rodney, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Rodney Toulson, and I am the parent of a 25-year-old autistic son. I am also a board member, and I love to do parent advocacy.
Awesome. So we will get started today by talking about the relevant laws, just so that everyone knows what laws we're going to be talking about as we move through this presentation. The first is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, and that is the law that entitles students to an individualized education program or an IEP. There's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So if you have a student that has a Section 504 plan, that will be covered by this law. And there's also the Code of Maryland Regulations, which outlines how these laws function in Maryland and gives a few distinctions in our state. So first, we're going to be looking at who is eligible for an IEP. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act provides that children from age birth all the way through 21 with disabilities have the right to access a free, appropriate public education through two types of plans. The first is called an Individualized Family Service Plan, or an IFSP, and that's for students birth through age 2, although there is an extended option for Maryland if the student would like to stay on that plan a little bit longer. And then through an individualized education program, or an IEP, which covers students aged 3 to 21 years of age. So who decides if a child with a disability needs help in school? That's an IEP, Individualized Education Program team, and they will help to decide if a student needs help. Members of this team can include parents and guardians, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, related service providers, and school administrator. What happens in this process is that a referral is made for either an IFSP or an IEP, and that referral determines whether a student needs an evaluation for special education and related services. Typically, children are first referred by their parents and guardians, but also school personnel such as a teacher could make the referral. The referral should be made in writing, it should be dated, and the parent should keep a copy of that referral. So once a referral is made, the team convenes and decides if they need additional assessment to determine if a student might have a qualifying disability under the IDEA, and to determine that evaluations are ordered. And those first evaluations need to be completed within 60 days of parental consent for evaluation. So when the parents attend the meeting to determine what assessments are needed, the school team is going to ask the parents to sign consent for those evaluations. Typically, once those assessments are ordered and that consent is signed, then the evaluations will begin and the assessments will be completed. And then a follow-up meeting will be held with the team to review the assessments and determine if, based on that data, the student is eligible for an IEP. So again, a parent or guardian needs to provide written consent for those assessments, and they need to be performed and explained by a qualified professional. And if the parent or guardian disagrees with the assessment results, they can request an independent educational evaluation, or an IEE, to be done by someone outside of the school system. So typically, school system staff would be performing those assessments, but if the parent disagrees with it, they can request that IEE. Something to be aware of about the IEE, though, is it can kind of trip parents up a little bit. If a request is made for an IEE, there are two options. Either the school can pay for it, or if they don't want to pay for an outside assessment for whatever reason, whether they think their initial assessment was good, or they think the results are sound of their initial assessment and they don't believe an IEE is necessary, they have to put that reason in writing and file for a due process hearing so that an independent administrative law judge can determine whether the IEE is necessary. So I always like to tell parents, when you're thinking about an IEE, think carefully about whether you want it and why you want it, because if the school system declines to pay for it, you could find yourself in a due process hearing. So some tips for the evaluation process. I'm going to turn this over to my co-presenter, Rodney, at this point to share some tips.
All right, I'll read these tips and then give you some more tips. One is keep a copy of the letter requesting an evaluation and the consent for the evaluation form that they signed in. What you really want to do is get someplace where you can put multiple documents because you're going to be building your files because this is a process. So you want a place where you can store all kinds of documents, and you want to keep a calendar and a timeline of the process. Complete any parent rating scales requested by the school system to help your child become eligible for special education and related services. And again, keep a copy of all documents in a binder. Have one place where at one place at the snap of a finger where you can access all the records. If they have outside evaluations, you may wish to share them with the IEP team. That's usually good because the left hand wants to know what the right hand is doing. Provide a written consent to the initiation of services if they agree with the proposed IFSP or IEP. But in addition to that, here's some additional tips. When you go to your IEP meeting, remember that you are representing your child. You're your child's attorney. And so one of the best things that I can say is always dress appropriately. This is a business meeting for your child. So you want to come in business attire. And I'm not saying $1,000 money suit, no, but just business attire because you're conducting business. And a lot of times at the IEP meeting, they will misjudge you by the way you dress. And so we want to be cognizant of that. Also, you want to bring a notepad. And on this notepad, when you first get there, you want to ask for everyone's name. And you want to write the name down, everyone's name and what they do, because that's for your records. And on the next page, you want to put what resolution would you like to see. A lot of times it helps if you bring a resolution like, I would like to see this, I would like to see that for my child. If you come with nothing, then you give them nothing to go on. And so they may come with something you don't like. So it's always good for you to come with that resolution. What would you want to see happen with your child? Try to bring your own questions. What questions are you asking of the IEP team? And for each question, put it on a separate page. And the reason why I'm saying a separate page, you want to have the answer to each of your questions. And that'll help keep your answers organized, that when I asked this was the response. And another thing that you want to do, the IEP process is a long process. You're going to be working with the IEP team for a length of time. So you want to come to that initial meeting with a collaborative mindset. You want to build a partnership. And so that's one of the biggest things, build a partnership. Come with a collaborative mindset that we're going to build a partnership and we're going to collaborate and go through this process together. And I'll turn it back to Alyssa.
Sorry, I had to get myself unmuted there. Thank you, Rodney. I think those are great tips. A couple other things I wanted to ask you about that are common questions that we get. And I wanted to see if you had some tips for these as well. Is, parents say that they feel like teachers might have more to say than they're really able or willing to reveal in an IEP meeting. Do you have thoughts on how to maybe get good information out of the participants in a meeting?
Yes. Actually, one thing I would suggest is build that same relationship with that teacher and have that open line of communication with that teacher. So you're talking about things. And actually, it is not against the law to talk to the teacher before the IEP meeting and say, hey, what things are good for my child? What things need to be brought out? And so building that relationship is kind of like the meeting before the meeting. And, you want to do that because remember, you want to put the teacher in a position to help you as much as possible. So the better your relationship with the teacher, the more communication, then those things can come out in the meeting. Excellent question.
What about when school teams are using terminology you're not familiar with? What would you suggest then?
Ask them to explain it like they would to a 5-year-old. And you want to talk about layman's terms because you're right, there are a lot of big words and a lot of diagnoses that we have. Like, what does that mean? What is that? And so you want to ask them, can you say that to me like I am a 5-year-old so I can fully understand it? And what I would say to parents, don't feel bad if you don't understand it. We're there to get an understanding. So it's okay to say, hey, I don't know what that is. Can you explain it to me? Can you break it down to me like a 5-year-old? So make sure you fully know everything that's being said.
Absolutely. I agree. Thank you. All right. So moving back into a little bit of the black letter law here. So what is special education? An eligible student with a disability. So if after that whole process we just talked about where we're doing assessments, we determine that a student is eligible for special education, then the student does have the right to a free, appropriate public education or a FAPE provided in the least restrictive environment or LRE. And special education is specially designed instruction that's intended to meet the child's unique needs, and it allows them to access the general education curriculum. And special education does include related services, which I'll cover very shortly. So related services are those services that a student needs to be successful in school and to access their education. That might be transportation services for some students. They need help getting to and from school. They need special accommodations to do that. Perhaps speech language services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, social work services, psychological services, nursing services. And it's important to say that not every student needs every one of these related services, but based on the assessments and based on the student's needs, different combinations of these related services might be appropriate to help the student access their education. So just a brief word on an IFSP. So this is, again, we covered this at the beginning a little bit, but this is for those younger learners. It's a document or a written plan that focuses on the child and the family and the services that the family needs to help enhance their child's development. Some unique features of the IFSP are that they're provided in the child's natural environment. So that could be the home if that's where the student spends most of their time, or a Head Start program, a daycare, or a preschool. IFSPs include the child's present level of functioning and their areas of need, as well as family information to include parental concerns. So that's an awesome time for parents to make sure they're including what they're worried about and what they want to focus on. Results or outcomes that are expected to be achieved by the child, early interventions or services that the student will receive, and when, where, and how those services will be provided. All right, some more tips, Rodney. You may have covered some of these, but we will just dive back in to make sure we're not missing anything. So some tips for IEP and IFSP development.
Absolutely. The first one says, bring a partner, bring a friend, partner, spouse to the IFSP or IEP meeting if it would be helpful. Sometimes the IEP meetings can be very emotional. And so you want a support system for yourself. And so bring that person that can keep you calm and that can be there to support you. You want to ask questions to the professional who's making the recommendations. And also that goes back, as Alyssa said, to the first set of tips. Bring your own questions. And if you ask questions, make sure you get a complete answer. Take notes during the meeting for later reference. And also, if you disagree with something, you can ask that disagreement be input into the IEP notes to show that you disagreed with something. So you can always ask for things to be put into the notes and ask to record the meeting. If they will want to listen to it later or share information with a service provider, that'd be great. The advantage of recording a meeting is that you can play it back and look at it. And then you may find that I should have asked this, I didn't ask this. So it's always good if you can have a good reference. And it says that they should provide an advance notice. Exactly. No school should ever call you the day before an IEP meeting, say, hey, we have an IEP meeting scheduled the next day. No, you should have advance notice so that you can prepare your schedule to be at that IEP meeting. And I want to say something else. Remember that you're working as a partner. And I'll mess with Alyssa. If this were a law firm, imagine that you would be the managing partner because you're the advocate for your child. So you are in a partnership. So it's not like everything should be dictated to you. You are an equal partner in this process. I want you to remember that. You can request breaks if it gets emotional. Hey, we need a 5-minute break. I need to go out and gather myself, come back in, try to remain calm. Again, it's a collaborative process and we want to be collaborative. And I know things can get emotional, but we always want to try to remain in a collaborative mindset. And one thing else I'll add, I'll turn it back over to Alyssa. Always leave with a copy of the IEP, a signed copy that day. Do not accept it. Hey, we'll give it to you later. We'll send it. No, you should leave with a copy that day. So that's about it. Alyssa, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. One thing to just add about the recordings, I put my lawyer hat on, right? We want to make sure everybody is giving a heads up when you plan to record. Maryland is a consent state for recording. So you have to let people know you want to record, that you intend to, and get their consent to do it. So just be sure you do that so you don't get yourself in any sticky situations. That's not always clear from our slide here. So I want to just stress that. Okay. So thinking about educational placement, this comes up quite often when parents are thinking about, well, where is my student going to receive their services? What school are they going to be in? So that is an IEP team determination, and it's based on really what the student needs and what the school can provide. And school systems need to provide a variety of placement options to families. And it's only if the school system can't find an appropriate placement that could meet the student's needs in a public setting that they would pay for the student to attend a private separate day school or a non-public special education facility. So let's break down a little bit what that looks like here. I always think about placement like a ladder. When we talk about least restrictive environment, that is a concept that in the law that encourages us as much as possible to include students with disabilities with their typically developing peers. And that, the more interaction you have with your typically developing peers, the less restrictive it's considered. So if we start here at 1, that's what I think of as the bottom of the ladder, right? That's very included with their typically developing peers in a general education classroom in their neighborhood school. Moving up that ladder might be some time away from their general education peers with a special educator working more particularly on their goals and objectives, getting that specially designed instruction. Climbing up the ladder, you may have more than half your day with a special educator. You may have a self-contained class in a comprehensive school. You may have a self-contained class in a public separate day school, which is a public school, but specifically for students with disabilities. Above that, you could have placement in a private facility or a non-public special education facility. Beyond that would be a residential facility, because that's considered more restrictive because you are living there. So you have even less interaction with your typically developing peers. And then finally, home and hospital instruction is considered one of the most. You may have a self-contained class in a comprehensive school. You may have a self-contained class in a public separate day school, which is a public school, but specifically for students with disabilities. And above that, sorry about that. I was getting some feedback on my end. So above that would be a home and hospital instruction, which would be for students that are receiving their education either in a hospital setting or at home due to either a severe emotional disability or a medical need. Okay, a note about ESY. The IEP team needs to consider if a student's IEP has goals related to critical life skills. Now, conveniently, like a lot of things in the law, critical life skills is not defined very clearly. So you can use your best advocacy skills to make a pitch for what you think is a critical life skill. But generally, we're seeing a lot of functional academics, student who need basic reading or math instruction. All of those things can be considered critical life skills. So the team is going to decide, do they have goals related to critical life skills? And if they do, is there a chance that they're going to regress over the summer break or over an extended school break? Are they making a degree of progress on their goals and objectives that might be jeopardized if we took an extended break? Are there emerging skills or breakthrough opportunities? Do they have significant interfering behaviors? What is the nature and severity of their disability? And are there any special circumstances? And the team needs to determine if the student's ability to make progress during the year is in jeopardy if they do not get those extended school year services. So an extended school year service is not summer school. It's not credit recovery. It is intended to bridge the gap during an extended school closure, like a summer break, so that a student can continue to progress on their goals and objectives. And it's typically about 4 weeks in the summer and typically not a full day of learning. It's like a half day generally. It depends on the county, but yeah. So some tips for ESY, Rodney?
Yes. One thing I'll start with that's not on the screen is when you're thinking about ESY, you should be really processing during the school year things that your son or daughter may need during the extended school year. One tip is that don't wait until the end to start thinking about things. You can be during the school year thinking about these are goals, these are skills that my son, my daughter needs that'll be good for the ESY, because that'll help you be more of an advocate in making the goals and making sure that they're goals that fit your child. And the first bullet says the meeting should be held before the end of the school year to determine eligibility. Usually I would say normally that meeting should take place sometime in April. If you haven't heard of a scheduled meeting in April, please reach out, because you don't want to wait till May and June, because that's the end of the year and there are a lot of things going on. So you want to make sure that that meeting happens around April. And again, if they don't schedule it automatically, request it in writing. That could be an email like, hey, we haven't had an email for the IEP meeting. When is that meeting going to take place? And the IEP should review the eligibility for the ESY each year. So never let them say, well, based on last year. No, let's base it on this year, this current year. And so you want to be a part of that, but you definitely want to think about what life skills, what are things that my son, my daughter needs that we can add, that we can advocate more to make sure, because the ESY, it is 4 weeks, but it'll be a fast 4 weeks. So you want to get the bang for the buck. So again, make sure that you're a part of that process, but that during the school year, you're assessing what goals and what things that the child needs for the ESY school year.
Thank you,
And
Rodney. I think those are great tips. Sorry, I clicked ahead there for a second, but just previewing what we're moving towards. We are moving towards transition planning. So for transition planning, the IDEA states that all children with disabilities are entitled to transition services, also known as transition planning. So we might use those terms interchangeably throughout this portion of the presentation. And transition services are provided by the school to help students transition from high school to the adult world. So what is transition planning? It's a process that brings students and their families together with educators and other adult service providers. Sorry, getting ahead of myself, to help plan and prepare students to leave school and enter a secondary school environment, such as an adult day program, employment, vocational school, or college. And in Maryland, we're fortunate because that has to begin by age 14. Federally, under the IDEA, the age that is designated is 16, but in Maryland, we have an early transition planning provision in our laws, which require that schools start at 14. So that is definitely to our benefit. So here's some transition planning information. First, we're looking at the various diploma options that students have. They can pursue a high school diploma, a certificate of program completion, or a general education diploma. Certificate of program completion, typically those are being pursued by students that are cognitively not able to earn a high school diploma and to meet the credit requirements for a high school diploma. So they take an alternate curriculum and alternate assessments. And those students typically can work until they're age 21 on those requirements if needed. The general education diploma, the GED, sometimes students just aren't really doing very well in high school and they think, you know what, I'm just going to take the GED. That is an option. But we always advise families that the GED requires about a 10th grade level of education to pass. So that's something to think about if that's an option that you're exploring with your student, is just thinking about whether that's a realistic option given their circumstances. And then some post-secondary options might be adult day program, employment or supported employment, vocational programs, and college are some things that students might consider after their transition. So transition plans need to be results oriented. So they should say that Alyssa will go on to be a lawyer, not Alyssa hopes to or wants to or thinks she might. We need to be results oriented here based on the individual and what they want to do, with the understanding that these are teenagers that can change and that is fine. But we are planning based on what they want to do and what their goals for themselves are. They should be designed to improve academic and functional skills to enable the student to meet those goals and help them to transition out of high school. So here's just some samples of goals for a transition plan, things you might focus on in different areas. The student might need additional academic skills, such as improving their reading, written language, or math or problem solving. Maybe they want to be a cashier, so we need to improve those basic math skills. Communication skills, do they need to improve their ability to follow or give directions, clearly communicate information, understand information that's communicated to them, just for some examples. For social skills, are they pursuing a career where they're going to need phone answering skills and learning to make calls, displaying appropriate workplace behavior, learning to protect themselves from victimization, those sorts of things. Occupational and vocational skills, do they need to learn to arrive on time, to use a time card, to take constructive criticism, using appropriate tone of voice, any of those sorts of things. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some ideas to get you started of things that you might think about that would be appropriate to incorporate in a transition plan, depending on the student's goals. Again, they need to be a measurable post-secondary outcome. The student will, not the student hopes to. And the path toward achieving that goal needs to be obvious and needs to occur before the student leaves high school. So how are we going to help them before they leave high school to actually set them on the path to achieve whatever the goal is? An important thing to note here is there is no recourse if the student doesn't ultimately achieve the goal. So if my goal had been Alyssa will be a lawyer, and I had gone on to do something else and had not gone to law school, that's not on the high school, right? But if I expressed in high school that I wanted to be a lawyer, they needed to make a transition plan for me that would help me achieve that goal, even if I don't actually pursue it once I walk out the door. So for the IEPs for transition planning, they need to include documentation of evidence of age-appropriate transition assessment. So students need to be given assessments to determine what it is that they want. That can be, qualitative interviews, it can be transition inventories, all kinds of things, but there needs to be evidence that that was done to really ascertain what the student wants to do. There needs to be appropriate measurable post-secondary goals in employment, education and training, and independent living if it's appropriate. And there needs to be goal tracking in the IEP, so measuring that we're actually following through on the things we say we're going to do. And then annual IEP goals related to the transition service needs. A few more things. The transition needs to include transition services, courses of study that would reasonably enable the student to meet those post-secondary goals. And then when we're discussing transition, we need to see evidence that the student was invited to their IEP meeting. This is really critical when a student is transition aged. It's always important if a student is able to attend their IEP meetings to give their input, but especially when they're transition aged, and especially when we're talking about what they want to do after high school, it's really important as much as possible to include the student. So we need evidence that they were invited. And then evidence that the parent or the student, if they've reached the age of majority, has provided consent to invite agency representatives if it's appropriate for those representatives to be invited based on the student circumstances. And then those agency representatives, if consent is given, actually need to be invited. So some tips for transition planning, Rodney.
Absolutely, thank you. Start early. Transition planning begins at 14 in Maryland, so take advantage of it. And it says exiting the school system may be far away, but we know that time will go past in a flash. So you want to engage the student as much as possible, encourage them to participate, as Alyssa said. Make sure adequate time is set aside for the transition discussion. Here are a couple extra things. You want to find out who is that transition specialist that'll be working with your child. You want to build a relationship with that person, because remember, it starts at 14 and your child may be in school until they're 18, maybe all the way up to 21. So you definitely want to have a good rapport with that transition specialist. One thing to consider is ask the transition specialist, what do they see in your child? And do you see the same thing? What about their mannerisms? What things do they think that they would be successful at? Here's some things to consider. What are the different experiences available to your son or your daughter in transition? Some schools may have where you can have different work experiences, different internship experiences. So you want to be a part of that. And then you want to ask, how long is that experience? And how do we get feedback? How do we know that your son or daughter like that experience or dislike that experience, and why? And consider, when you're talking about transitioning, is your son or daughter a social butterfly? Are they more of an introvert? And what experiences are available that match their personality, that will give them the best output? And the last thing I want to say, what is the ability to have multiple different experiences? Sometimes you may have one experience, but you really would want your child to have 2 or 3 different experiences, because that is the only way that you're going to know what their niche is, or begin to wrap your mind around this by these different experiences while they're in transition. And this will help make it smooth when they leave. So those are some things that you want to consider and some tips. Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you, Rodney. Rodney, I'm getting some technical advice from the powers that be. Are you, is your video spotlighted on your end or pinned?
It was, yes. You want me to remove it?
Yeah, can you unpin?
Okay. How's that?
I hope, okay. I'm sure I'll be told if it's not. But some other things, Rodney, I wanted to bring up, a question that we get a lot is how to address improving transition services if you don't feel like your team is really following through on that. And also, what if your team just isn't bringing it up? What if they're really glossing over the transition planning? What thoughts do you have on that?
Wow. Again, you start being that person, the transition period. In fact, when the meeting starts, you can say, hey team, we haven't been talking about transitioning. I need to talk about transitioning. My son, my daughter's getting older, so we need to discuss the transition period. In fact, I would say, just like earlier in the slide, it was talking about sending a written notice. If that's not happening, you want to send a written notice. Hey, at the next IEP meeting, I would like to discuss transition services because they haven't been discussed and my child is this age. So you definitely want to put that in writing, your desire to have transition services, and it's not happening. And unfortunately, if it continues not to happen, then you may have to reach out to someone, to an advocacy, or someone like Alyssa, or another form of advocate to back you in that. Hopefully it won't get that far, but I would say you definitely want to start with, when you get to the meeting, say, hey, we want to talk about the transitioning, and send that email, send that written notice that, hey, I need to talk about this. It's not happening. So you definitely want to make sure that you're stressing it and saying that, you don't want to talk about anything else until we talk about the transitions.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, sometimes a good way that I've found to frame it is to say that we want to start with a student who's transition age, start with the transition plan, because then we can build the rest of the IEP with an eye towards the goal of effective transition planning. So I totally agree. And I think if you find yourself in a circumstance where the school team doesn't do that and they do save the transition planning for the end, and by the end everybody's totally fatigued and worn down, it's okay to ask to postpone too, and say, I really think we need to come back to the table so that we can really effectively transition plan. So yeah, I totally agree. Great tips. Thank you. Okay, so a little bit about dispute resolution. So what if you're going through this process and you have built an IEP with the team and you have just sort of come to an impasse? The team is saying one thing and you're saying something else, and you just can't seem to see eye to eye. There are mechanisms in the law for parents to resolve disputes. And I'm going to kind of walk through them from most collaborative to most adversarial, we'll say. So the first is to request an IEP meeting to discuss your concerns. That is always, my office, that's what we recommend. Start there, talk about what you're concerned about, try to use what you know about your child to get the team to see it your way. You are an equal participant in the IEP process as a parent, so you have every right to go in there and make your pitch and make your case. So that's a good starting point. If that's not effective, you can contact the Office of Special Education for the county where you live. Most counties have professionals who are county level and work in a supervisory or an advisory role to IEP teams. So if you're having trouble, those folks can come in and sort of work with the IEP team to maybe think through a problem creatively or offer suggestions that the team hadn't thought of to resolve the issue. If that doesn't work, you can file a complaint with the State Department of Education, and I will put a pin in that for a second because I have a slide coming up on that next. You can file a request for mediation in writing. Be aware that mediation is an informal process with an independent mediator, so somebody who can make a decision on this, but it's also something where both parties need to agree to mediate. So just because you want to mediate doesn't necessarily mean that the school system will. So when you file for mediation, just be aware that that could be declined. And vice versa. If the school team wants to mediate, but you don't think that's going to be effective, you can decline that as well. So that goes both ways. Next is to participate in a resolution session. That comes along if you file for a due process hearing. I think of it sort of as a last ditch effort to resolve the concerns before going to court. But if you're not, if you really feel like you're at an impasse, both parties can waive that if they really don't think it's going to be effective. And then finally is to file for a due process hearing. That is a formal and expensive court proceeding. I would not advise going through it without a lawyer if you can help it, because they are, it does involve putting on witnesses, presenting evidence, taking testimony from witnesses, all that stuff that's just complicated and kind of tedious and is helpful to have a lawyer walk you through. So if you do want to go that route, I would suggest at least consulting with a lawyer on that. So another word about filing a state complaint, to return to that. These complaints can be filed by parents, advocates, or attorneys, and it's a written complaint with the State Department of Education that can be filed if you believe a child's rights have been violated. A copy of the complaint needs to also be sent to the local director or coordinator of special education for your county. State complaints are great, but they don't cover everything. So state complaints tend to be more procedural in nature. So if a student, for example, did not receive services that were outlined in their IEP, or the school system didn't conduct the evaluations in a timely manner, or they violated discipline procedures, those things would be appropriate for a state complaint. Complaints that are more substantive, like a kind of squishier analysis of, did my child receive the free appropriate public education they're entitled to, those more substantive questions typically aren't going to be appropriate for a state complaint, because it's a mostly records-based investigation, and MSDE isn't typically going to second guess the judgment of the team that came together on those more substantive issues. But when these are filed, MSDE has to complete their investigation within 60 calendar days. That period can be extended if there's mutual agreement, or if there's some other decision is reached that the parties agree on. And something to really be conscious of with state complaints is there is a 1-year timeline. So if you're listening to this right now and thinking, yes, I have procedural violations, my kid's in high school, and I have a list of them going back to kindergarten, not going to work for a state complaint, unfortunately. Look back through the year and allege the violations that have happened within the last year, and that's all that's going to be appropriate for this state complaint, okay? So just some good stuff there. All right, so some tips for dispute resolution. Rodney?
All right, here's some tips. Of course, the first one says, explain your concerns to the IEP team, giving examples. And when we say examples, put your concerns in writing. Every time you have a concern, email that concern to someone and print a copy of that email. Because remember, we're going all the way back to the beginning when we said we want to keep all our documentation in one place. So we definitely want to email our concerns. And again, it says touch base with your service coordinator regularly so that they're not surprised by your concerns. So you should make an honest effort to reach out to them so no one's caught off guard. And you want to always participate in the IFSP or the IEP meeting. You always want to be there, and that way you can get all the information that you need and you get a chance to continue to build that collaborative partnership. And as Alyssa said, you can contact the Partners for Success program or Parents Place of Maryland if you have to. And one thing that I'll say, when you run into this impasse, here's a couple questions to ask. What is the roadblock that's keeping us from meeting in the middle? And you want to use that word roadblock. What is this roadblock that's keeping us from meeting in the middle? And you always want to give your concern from the parent perspective. So if they say something you don't agree, say, well, I hear you, but from my perspective as mom or dad, this is my perspective, and this is what I would like. And again, we don't want you to have to reach out to one of these agencies, but if you do, be nice about it. Like, hey, okay, we're reaching an impasse, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to go to next steps. But you always want to keep that collaborative mindset and definitely, be as nice as possible, even if you have to agree to disagree and move on. But as Alyssa said, if you have to, you want to go that route, but you do want to consider, if you're filing a due process complaint, the time and money that's going to come into it. But also, we definitely want you to be that advocate for your child. So there are other agencies that you can reach out to that'll help you, because you don't want to let yourself get bullied or rolled over so that your son or daughter doesn't get the best services possible. So that's some tips. Thank you, Alyssa.
Absolutely. I agree. Great tips. All right. So a quick true or false. We will just go through these fairly quickly. So first, true or false, parents are equal participants in IEP meetings. This is absolutely true. Parents are definitely equal participants in the IEP meeting. And you should feel empowered to advocate on behalf of your student because you do know them best as their parent or guardian. Parents may express their disagreement with a proposed IEP by not signing it. So this is a tricky one. Yes, it is. This is kind of true and false. You can express your disagreement with a proposed IEP by not signing it, but that will not impact the school's ability to implement that IEP unless it is the very first IEP. So the very first IEP, they need your signature to initiate services. After that, they can continue to provide services, whether or not you sign the IEP, unless you officially revoke services and revoke consent for services. So if you are unhappy with an IEP and you just want to show them that you disagree by not signing it, that's fine. But you have to understand that doing that won't stop services. That's how that works. All right, so IEP teams must implement recommendations by outside providers like a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist. This is false. IEP teams do not have to implement recommendations by outside providers, but they do have to consider them. So you may go to Kennedy Krieger or Mount Washington or wherever you go and get a beautiful neuropsych with wonderful recommendations and present it to your school. They do need to meet and consider those recommendations, but they do not have to implement all of them. There is a recognition that educational settings and clinical settings are sometimes different. So they should be able to substantiate why they're not doing something if they're not taking the recommendation. but there is no requirement that just because you have outside recommendations that they automatically be fully implemented. And then transition planning in Maryland begins at age 16. False. We are very lucky. It begins at age 14 in Maryland. All right, so then that covers kind of the bulk of the presentation. I just wanted to leave everyone with some resources, because it's, presentations are great to come to, but it's always good to go and do a little bit more digging if you're still curious. So I'm going to walk you through some of these guidance documents and resources so that you know where to look if you need to dig a little deeper. So first is the State Department of Education guidance. MSDE has issued guidance and technical assistance bulletins on many, many topics. And that's on the Division of Special Education and Early Intervention Services link on the website. Just as kind of a pro tip, the easiest way to find these is to type in MSDE TAB on Google. That's Maryland State Department of Education Technical Assistance Bulletins. Sometimes the MSDE website is a little tough to navigate, so if you just type it into Google, that link should come up for you. But there are technical assistance bulletins on a variety of topics. Probably if you're thinking, man, I want to learn more about this, there's a technical assistance bulletin out there. So for example, Maryland's 5-day rule about when you should be receiving documents from the school, technical assistance on how to qualify for a specific learning disability, English language learners, when parental consent is needed, restraint and seclusion, home and hospital teaching, all kinds of stuff. There's also been a lot of technical assistance bulletins issued by the State Department of Education during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you have questions specific to COVID-19 and provision of services and recovery services and all of that, there are guidance documents from the State Department of Ed addressing, again, a wealth of topics. So this is a great, great resource for families. Something to bear in mind is that a technical assistance bulletin is not the law, but it is the State Department of Education's interpretation and implementation of the law. So it is persuasive often to IEP teams to kind of present this information to them if they don't already know it. Next is the transition planning guide. This is a great resource. A lot of the information that I shared with ideas about different goals that you can build and that sort of thing on a transition plan can be found in here. And the transition planning guide does break down ideas for goals and objectives based on age and based on whether the student is exiting with a certificate of program completion or a high school diploma. So again, lots and lots of great resources there. COVID-19 guidance, there's some federal guidance that we've linked to here. Yeah, that's the federal guidance. So like if you want to know what the federal government is saying, but again, these State Department of Education technical assistance bulletins really do take a much deeper dive than the guidance that the federal government has issued. Here's some general IFSP or IEP online resources. So the Center for Parent Information or Resources, the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. This is a great way if you're not sure how to find a professional, an attorney or an advocate. If you're looking for one, there is a professional locator on the website there. So if you're interested in working with somebody, that can be a good way to track them down. IDEA information is there. Section 504 information is linked here. And then rights law is also a great resource for families. There's a lot of information there on special education law that really breaks it down in a way that's manageable and digestible for families and not just kind of a recitation of the black letter law. Disability Rights Maryland is also a great resource. They are the state's designated protection and advocacy organization for individuals with disabilities. So their job is to protect and advocate for folks with disabilities in a variety of arenas. So they are a really great resource. You can call them and do an intake. Their services are free if they do decide to take your case. So that's another plus. And they have a really wonderful special education handbook and school discipline handbook, which is linked here as well. So if you are looking to dive a little deeper, deepen your understanding of special education or school discipline, those handbooks are fantastic. And you can check them out on their website. And then here's our contact information. Rodney and I are both happy to chat with you further if you have questions for us. And then my office certainly is available if you have additional questions. We can only take cases for active Kennedy Krieger patients, but we are more than willing to talk to anyone with questions. So our intake line is there as well. I think that covers it for today. Rodney, anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Oh, no, no. Oh, just one thing. Just one thing. When Alyssa, I just want to reiterate one thing. When we were talking about the true or false about, a parent can sign or not sign the IEP to show their disapproval, I just want to remind them that that's one of the things that you can have input into the notes. And that way, it's there. You have them notate that you do not agree with this, whatever that is. You can say, hey, I need that documented in the IEP notes that I do not disagree with this, that I do disagree with this.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you. I think that's really important, is you can memorialize your disagreement in those IEP minutes. And that's a great way to document it. All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending. And please let us know if you have any questions.